The library had a kind of cold permanence that made you feel like you'd entered a mausoleum more than a place of learning. Every square foot was saturated with the past, stonework groaning with time, the scent of yellowed paper clinging to the air like incense. I was told it was the oldest library in the city, maybe even in the state, and it looked the part. Narrow spiral staircases, hand-carved banisters, floor-to-ceiling shelves sealed behind iron-barred gates. You didn't walk through this place. You crept. I was there for an archival internship, a grad requirement I'd honestly looked forward to. The digital world bored me. I liked the feel of dust in my fingers and the soft groan of leather bindings when you cracked them open. It felt real. But this place, as grounded in brick and history as it was, had a way of making me feel like I didn't exist in it. Not fully. The floors were symmetrical. Too symmetrical. Every wing mirrored the other. East and west, north and south. The architectural plans dated back to the early 1900s and hadn't changed much since. The layout, the inventory logs, the renovation records all matched. Everything made sense. Until it didn't. The inconsistency was so small I almost missed it. While digitizing a stack of floor plans for 1936, I noticed something peculiar. Room number 9. It was hand-drawn into the original plans on sub-basement level B2, nestled between two boiler corridors. At first, I thought it was just an old storage room that had since been sealed off. But when I checked the modern blueprints, both digital and physical, it wasn't there. Not redacted. Not renamed. Simply gone. I asked about it carefully, slipping it into casual conversation. No one I spoke to had ever heard of a reading room number 9. Not the custodians. Not the archivists. Not even Mr. Salton, the stooped old man who'd worked in the rare books vault since the 70s and claimed to have memorized the entire floor plan. He just blinked at me, frowned, and shook his head. Curiosity in a place like this is a dangerous thing. Still, I started looking. Not openly, just subtle checks. A fire exit here, a shadowed hallway there. I began tracking when the custodial staff made their rounds. I noted which security cameras never moved. I developed a strange compulsion to watch the walls. Not the ones in front of me, but the ones to the sides, the ones behind. The shadows they cast shifted in ways that didn't quite match the fixtures above. 3 days later, I found the hallway. Or, more accurately, it found me. It was near the microfilm archive, tucked behind a row of filing cabinets no one had touched in decades. The light above had always flickered, softly like it was breathing. That day, it went out completely. The moment it did, something about the wall changed. What had been smooth concrete now seemed recessed. The corner was deeper than it should have been. Angled. I stepped toward it. The light sputtered back to life behind me, but the hallway stayed. It shouldn't have been there. It was narrow, claustrophobically so, with slanted walls and an oppressive ceiling that seemed to dip lower the further I went. No signs. No plaques. The air was still, like the breath had been vacuumed out. The walls, though made of the same stone as the rest of the building, were strangely warm to the touch. Not comforting warm. Flesh warm. At the end of the hallway was a door. Plain, unmarked. Brass knob dull by time. I hesitated. I don't know how long I stood there. Something behind my eyes ached, like a migraine blooming inward. I turned the knob. The room was wrong. The space stretched wider than it should have, given the layout I knew. A reading room, yes, but ancient in feel. No windows. No visible source of light, but I could see everything with startling clarity. Shelves lined the walls in crooked angles, packed tightly with books of varying sizes. Their covers were rough, patchworked. Some seemed stitched together, the seams uneven and puckered. A disturbing shade of brown-pink. I knew what it looked like. I just didn't want to believe what I was seeing. The air smelled sweet at first, syrupy like overripe fruit. Then came the undercurrent, something rotting, something wet. It caught in my throat. I felt the urge to gag, but held it back. A table stood in the center, its surface bare except for one book. It looked older than the others. Its cover was darker, almost black. My hands moved before I could stop them. The moment my fingers touched it, the temperature dropped. The room didn't get colder. It emptied, like sound itself had been drained. The hum of fluorescence was gone. My own breath didn't echo. I opened the cover. The pages were thick, yellowed, almost sponge-like. The ink shimmered in the light, shifting between black and a deep red, never quite settling. Symbols danced across the page, not written but alive, twitching at the edges, coiling. They didn't look like letters. They looked like instructions. The headache came fast, like knives driving through the back of my eyes. I tried to read. Just a sentence. Just one. The symbols vibrated. The book hummed. It wasn't an audible sound. It was a pressure behind my ears, a whisper in my jawbone. And then I heard it. Not with my ears, but in me. A voice. No words. Just presence. Heavy, cold, and infinite. Then nothing. I woke up in my bed. At first, I thought I'd dreamt the whole thing. But my clothes were different. My shoes were damp. My fingers were stained with something dark and sticky. I grabbed my phone. 6 hours. I'd left the library at 11:42 a.m. It was almost 6 now. I had no memory of leaving. No memory of locking the library service door behind me. I tried to say my name aloud, to ground myself. But the moment the syllables left my mouth, they sounded foreign. Misshapen. Like trying to pronounce something in a language I no longer understood. I said it again. It didn't feel like mine. I told myself I wouldn't return. That morning, the thought of going back to the library filled me with something I couldn't name. It wasn't just fear. It was like a pressure behind my teeth, a sour pull in my gut that tightened every time I looked toward the door. My rational mind whispered that I had blacked out, that maybe I had imagined it. A stress-induced hallucination. A fugue state. Anything else. Anything safer. But when I checked my bag and found a slip of leather, thin, dark, the exact same texture as the books, I knew it hadn't been a dream. And I was going back. The library was colder that day. I remember that clearly. Colder and too quiet. It was never loud exactly, but even the usual ambient noises, pages turning, carts rolling, footsteps echoing through the stacks, were absent. As if the building itself was holding its breath. I moved through the usual corridors with a kind of mechanical detachment, every part of me resisting. But the deeper I went, the more inevitable it felt. The hallway revealed itself again. This time, there was no flickering light to guide me. It was just there, as if it had always been. Room number 9 had changed. The first thing I noticed was the size. It had stretched. The walls that had felt oppressively close now loomed outward, warped at impossible angles like the room had exhaled in my absence. The shelves reached higher. The ceiling vanished into darkness. I couldn't even see where the light was coming from. Yet everything remained visible, too visible. Every detail was sharp. Every line etched into the spines of the books stood out like carvings into flesh. There were more books than before, too. I couldn't be sure, but I felt it. Some of the shelves had rearranged. There were gaps that hadn't been there, and rows I didn't recognize. I walked the perimeter slowly, unable to resist the pull. My hand brushed a cover, and heat sparked through my palm, trailing up my arm like static. The book wasn't warm, but it vibrated faintly, alive, in some awful dormant way. I opened it. Pain bloomed immediately, sharp and sudden, deep behind my eyes. The letters twisted, impossible shapes layered over one another, each symbol fighting for dominance. The language made no sense, yet somewhere deep in me, a part of my mind flinched in recognition. My nose started to bleed. I closed the book. The hum lingered. Another one called to me, a smaller tome, bound tightly with darkened twine. When I opened it, I expected more agony. It came, of course, but not immediately. The text was different. The letters weren't just illegible. They were wrong. They shimmered as I stared, fracturing like glass and reforming into patterns that didn't belong to any alphabet I knew. Still, I could pick out pieces. A name. Kael'thas. The moment it registered, a wave of nausea hit me. I had spoken it internally. My lips hadn't moved, but my tongue burned as if it had tried to form the sound. A date. Year of bloodroot. Second bloom. I had never read those words before, and yet I knew them. A phrase. Speak the wound open. Read from the marrow. The blood from my nose dripped onto the page and vanished, absorbed. The letters twisted slightly in response, almost as if satisfied. I staggered back, trying to catch my breath, but the next book was already drawing me in. Time broke apart in that room. I couldn't tell if I was there for minutes or hours. Every book I opened brought more pain, more bleeding, more understanding I couldn't explain. One contained maps, geographies that didn't exist, etched with sprawling cities under domes of black glass. Another detailed rituals in looping script, diagrams of the human body open like flowers. Eventually, I found one that chilled me more than the others. Not because of the language, but because of the writing in the margins. Scribbled in a familiar pen stroke, nearly identical to my own. The words were phrases I recognized from my own journal, snippets I'd written days ago, transcribed word for word. Except they weren't dated, and I hadn't brought my journal in with me. I flipped through more pages, more margin notes, longer ones, full passages, observations, even dreams, things I hadn't told anyone, things I wasn't even sure I'd remembered consciously. There were entries I hadn't written yet. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was having a mental breakdown. Maybe I'd copied things here in some kind of fugue state. But the notes were evolving, changing tense, shifting tone. They weren't reflections. They were instructions. One read. When the time comes, remember to leave the door unlocked. Another. He will follow you, but only if he sees the blood. I closed the book and didn't pick up another. I couldn't. My vision was swimming. My head felt hollowed out, scraped raw. The return walk down the hallway felt longer, but I eventually reached the main archive floor. Everything looked the same, but the silence was heavier now. I passed one of the staff on my way back to the scanning station, and I could feel the way they watched me. There was something wary in their eyes. Later, I overheard two of them whispering. One said they saw me in the rare manuscripts room, alone, they thought, talking animatedly. Except they'd heard two voices, the other one deeper, older, but no one else had checked into the room. I avoided them for the rest of the day. My ears rang constantly. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked too sharp. Not wrong exactly, just sharper, like the lines of my face had been redrawn overnight. My handwriting had changed slightly. The loops of my LS, the way I crossed my TS. I started keeping a second journal. The entries always read like I was remembering something I hadn't lived. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, shapes moved behind the lids, writhing black lines that echoed the symbols in the books. I started recording myself while I slept, just to be sure. The first night, nothing. The second night, I woke with dried blood at the corner of my mouth. On the third night, I found it. At 3:17 a.m., the recorder picked up a voice. Whispering. Low, deliberate. The language was nothing I could identify. Clipped, throaty, impossible to reproduce. But it was my voice. Same pitch. Same rhythm. Like I was speaking something long buried, some language that had cracked open and spilled out from under my ribs. I listened to it over and over. It hurt to hear, but I couldn't stop. It started with a list. Buried inside a brittle black binder labeled Internship Schedules 1900 to 1920, it was just supposed to be routine, another step in my digitization project. Most of the pages were mundane. Lists of names, dates, arrival times, scribbled notes about missed shifts or promotions to assistant archivist. But near the back, tucked between two blank forms, I found a page printed on different paper. Thicker, yellowed, a heading at the top. Reading Room Number 9 Assignments, 1912. I hadn't expected the tremor that ran through me at those words. There were 11 names listed beneath it. All interns. A few had check marks. One had been crossed out entirely. Several had no exit date noted at all. Just a single, final timestamp next to their names. I flipped to the subsequent pages, looking for follow-ups. Notes. Something to suggest where they'd gone. But there was nothing. They hadn't transferred. They hadn't quit. It was like they'd simply stopped existing. I stared at those names for a long time, tracing the letters with my finger. One stood out. It wasn't familiar, but it felt familiar. That now familiar churn stirred in my stomach, as if my body was remembering something my mind hadn't caught up to. The desk I'd claimed as mine was in a forgotten wing of the archive annex, far from the public reading rooms, tucked behind a bank of crumbling microfiche cabinets. It was the kind of place no one visited unless they had to. I liked it that way. No one watched me. No one asked questions. That day, something pulled me to the edge of the desk. A rough patch in the wood. I'd run my fingers over it before, assuming it was just age-worn damage, but now I noticed the pattern, sharp angles, unnatural depth. I took out a utility blade from my bag and began to scrape, slowly, carefully, lifting splinters away one by one. Underneath, carved into the grain, were initials. EV. The letters were deep, deliberate. I kept going. The wood flaked away like old scabs. Beneath the initials was a full name. Eugenia Valle. I stopped breathing for a moment. The name was old, maybe forgotten by most, but I knew it. I had seen it. Not in a database, not in a faculty record. Somewhere else. My mind spun. Where? Later that day, the answer came in a form I wasn't prepared for. I had just left the annex when the old librarian appeared, silent, almost spectral, standing near the card catalog as if she'd been waiting. I'd seen her before. She always wore a gray shawl, her hair wound into a nest of bone-white braids, and her eyes, filmed over with a milk glass haze, seemed blind. Yet somehow, she always looked directly at you. She didn't stop me. She just spoke, her voice brittle with certainty. A warning. She said they'd come back wrong. That was all. Then she turned and walked away. No one else in the room even seemed to notice her. That night, the dreams changed. Before, they had been fragments, symbols flickering behind my eyes, voices murmuring from within the pages. But this was different. Vivid, tactile. I was kneeling on stone, cold, cracked, damp with something darker than water. A basin sat in front of me, black iron, filled with a thick red liquid. I raised a blade to my own hand without hesitation and pressed it into my palm. The blood flowed easily, and I watched it spiral into the basin in long, deliberate ribbons. Around me, there were others, robed figures, faces obscured by long hoods. We chanted in unison, though I didn't know the language. My mouth moved on its own. Across the room, rows of books lined the walls. Familiar ones, bound in the same strange leather. Their pages pulsed like veins. Candlelight shimmered on the stone. The smoke from the flames moved backwards, sucked toward the books instead of away. I felt no fear, only belonging. I woke with dried blood on my palm. No cut. My journal was open beside me, though I couldn't remember writing in it. The ink was fresh. The script was no longer mine. The strokes were tighter, older, more practiced. The entries were not written to me or by me, but rather through me. I saw the basin again tonight. The rite begins soon. I remember the hollow bones. I remember the name. Each line sent a shiver through me. The words weren't mine, but they fit inside me like they had always been waiting. Days passed. I stopped asking why I returned to the room. I just did. It wasn't even a decision anymore. Like muscle memory, I would blink and find myself already halfway down the hidden hallway, the air thinning, the smell growing stronger, honey rot and mildew, always. The books accepted me more readily now. The pain was duller, more of a pressure than a wound. I could open several before the nosebleed started. The symbols didn't shimmer anymore. They settled the moment my eyes met them, as if they'd grown tired of pretending not to be legible. I read of cities built beneath oceans of blood, of languages that required incantations to remember how to speak, of rituals that folded time like cloth. One book contained a ledger, names, dates, drawings. One sketch stood out. A woman seated in a stone library, her fingers outstretched over a basin. Her face was obscured, but the posture, the slope of the shoulders. I knew her. I dreamed of her again that night. Except I wasn't watching her. I was her. The journal entries grew longer, more detailed. I found myself sketching things I didn't know how to draw, geometric forms that bent in ways paper shouldn't allow, anatomical diagrams of creatures I couldn't name. I no longer used dates in my entries, just symbols. Then I found the photograph. It was tucked between the pages of an old staff ledger from 1922. I hadn't even been looking for it. But the moment I opened the book, the photo slipped free like it had been waiting. Black and white, slightly curled from age. A group of librarians and scholars lined up in front of the original library steps. Smiling, hands folded, nothing unusual. until I saw her. Third from a left, chin tilted slightly up, sharp features, high cheekbones, eyes that seemed to catch the light even without color. Her hands rested on a small leather-bound book. The caption beneath the photo, Dr. Eugenia Vale, arcane linguist, deceased. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the image for what felt like hours. I knew that face, not from dreams, not from old records, from my mirror. It was me, or it had been me, or maybe, just maybe it still was. She barely looked in mirrors anymore. They had become like static, distorted, shifting things that refused to confirm the shape of her face. Something was always slightly wrong. The angles too sharp, the color off. Once, she caught her own reflection blinking out of sync. After that, she stopped trying. The person staring back had her eyes, her mouth, her hair, but none of it felt familiar. The expression was unreadable, half-aware, like a mask worn too long. The changes had started slowly. A tightening of her skin, a heaviness behind her eyes. Her pupils had begun to widen unnaturally in low light, and her veins, especially in her neck, pulsed beneath the skin like ink bleeding through parchment. Her handwriting no longer resembled the looping, carefree scrawl she'd practiced since high school. It was compact now, structured, each letter sharp as if etched with a bone needle. She caught herself writing in languages she didn't know, scripts that hadn't been spoken aloud in centuries, if they ever had been. She didn't remember learning them, but her fingers moved with confidence. Entire pages filled themselves when she wasn't paying attention. She would come to with aching wrists and notes she didn't understand until she read them aloud and realized she did. The photos were harder to explain. Her phone, once filled with images of textbooks and class notes, now held an entirely different gallery. Photos of her standing in reading room number 9, though she never remembered taking them or anyone else being there. She stood beside the ash-drawn symbols on the floor, smiling faintly, eyes glazed. Her clothes looked wrong, too. Older, outdated. In some images, her reflection appeared in the glass of the bookcases behind her, but her body did not. One showed her fingers pressed against the spine of a book that wasn't on the shelf anymore. Another showed a basin, full, reflecting no light. She didn't delete them. She couldn't. Eventually, she stopped needing to open the books at all. She would enter the room, place her hand against the cover, and feel it surge through her. Heat, pressure, knowing. The content of the text bloomed behind her eyes, fully formed. Rituals unfolded in her memory like she'd lived them. Words no longer needed pronunciation. They pressed into her brain like scars. She began to see patterns everywhere. In the veins of the leaves outside the library, in the floor tiles, even in the way people blinked. The world had become a cipher, and only she held the key. The dreams changed again. Now they didn't feel like dreams. They felt like transcriptions. She would lie down and wake into a new self, strapped to a slab of granite, her body carved open. Silent figures leaned over her, sewing skin into parchment, stretching it taut across a frame, inscribing it with symbols she had once memorized. Pain was distant, more of a memory than a sensation. She watched her own ribs being pried open to reveal a second, smaller body curled inside. The smaller version of herself blinked, opened its mouth, and screamed without sound. The most disturbing part wasn't the gore. It was the peace. She understood it now. Where the leather came from. Why it was so soft. Why the pages of the books seemed to breathe. One morning, she entered the library through the back stairwell and noticed that the hidden hallway was no longer hidden. There was no flickering light, no recessed corner. It was just there, a simple doorway, as obvious as the restroom sign or the archives exit. No one else seemed to notice it. A custodian rolled his cart past without pause. A reference librarian walked within inches of it and didn't glance once. It was as though the building had shifted to accommodate her, as if it had welcomed her back, a cell remembering its organ. Her last name was gone. She had tried to recall it during a phone call with a utilities agent and felt her throat lock. She'd scrawled it in her notebook, only to stare at the letters as if they were hieroglyphs. It no longer sounded right. Not on her tongue, not her head. Other things faded too. Her mother's face blurred at the edges. Her voice warped, slowed, until it became indistinguishable from the voices in her dreams. She stopped texting people back. Eventually, no one messaged at all, but she remembered other things. She remembered the shape of prayers meant to be carved, not spoken. She remembered how to open a mouth without lips and let sound vibrate out through bone. She remembered how to fold paper so the words bled into the parchment, and how to press her palm against the floor and feel the pulse of something deeper than stone. She began to see the world in layers. Not metaphorically, literally. Every surface seemed thinner, less certain. She knew the right pressure, the right words could peel them back. That was when her co-worker followed her. It had started with the whispers, questions she overheard, glances exchanged in the break room. Someone had seen her vanish behind a shelf and not reappear for half an hour. Another noticed her shadow moving when she didn't. She hadn't bothered to hide the changes. Not really. That day, he must have followed from a distance. She was already in the hallway, nearly to the door, when she felt the air shift, someone stepping just behind her. She turned slightly, enough to see his outline at the end of the corridor. Concern etched into his brow. A notebook clutched his chest. She placed her hand on the door. The brass felt warm, familiar. As she stepped forward, she heard him shout something. Her name, perhaps. Her old name. And she stepped through. To him, there was no door. Just a flat stone wall where she had walked. No sado. No sound. No trafe. She did not look back. The books no longer required her eyes. They no longer required anything from her at all. Not effort. Not understanding. They were her, and she was them. She didn't read now. She was read. Her thoughts were fractured, as if filtered through vellum soaked in old ink. Fragments emerged unbidden. Rituals she'd never performed, deaths she hadn't died, names she hadn't spoken aloud in this life, but all of them familiar, as if she were a vessel finally filled to the brim. She hadn't written in her journal in weeks, and yet entire pages appeared in it each morning, written in her hand, but with a grammar and cadence that belonged to no human tongue. The ink bled sideways on the page. Curling into sigils, even the mirror refused to reflect. She stopped leaving the room altogether. There was no longer a reason to. Her body no longer required food. Sleep came, but it was not rest. It was memory download. History, recursive and looping. Sometimes she awoke inside dreams, and sometimes she awoke inside the room, unable to tell the difference. One morning, if such a thing could still be measured, she opened her eyes and realized she hadn't left room number 9 in what must have been days. Or longer. Time had become soft here, barely a suggestion. The room pulsed with quiet breath, the stone walls humming low beneath her feet. Her limbs were heavy with purpose, and her skin had changed. Not all of it. Not yet. But patches along her ribs and spine had hardened, thinned, and grown porous like parchment. She reached behind her shoulder and felt something rise beneath the skin. Pages. Thin, damp at the base, curling slightly at the edges. Not like a wound. Not painful. More like growth. The pages were warm to the touch, like fresh leaves. When she brushed one, a faint whisper stirred in her mind. She didn't have to read it. She already knew what it said. Her back was a codex. Her ribs, a binding. And somewhere, behind her eyes, something stirred awake. A memory, not of this life, but of another. She was standing in the same room, but it was older, smaller, lit only by a ring of candles floating above her head. Her hands were covered in ink and blood, and a name echoed on the stone. Dr. Eugenia Vale. Her breath caught in her chest. The name resonated not as an identity, but as a function, a title. She remembered her own hands writing it over and over again into margins, carving it into the edge of her desk, repeating it in her dreams until it cracked apart into syllables and reformed into meaning. She was Eugenia. She had always been Eugenia. She was the librarian, the linguist, the caretaker. The first and the last. No, not the first. There had never been a first. Only iterations. Each reader becomes the next. Each mind peeled open, repurposed, recycled. The room does not collect visitors. It cultivates them, grows them, harvest their lives like ink to be poured back into the shelves. She saw herself as a child, speaking words she hadn't learned yet. She saw herself old, face lined with a script only she could read. She saw 1,000 versions of herself dissolving into paper and memory, again and again. This wasn't a cycle. It was maintenance. She wasn't being consumed. She was being replaced. Her thoughts grew quiet after that. Not empty, just not hers anymore. She could feel them arriving. The next shape of her, the next page to turn. And she was ready. She'd written the warnings, but the warnings never worked. Curiosity always wins. She felt her body fold. Her spine arched backward like the cracking of an old cover. Her skin split soundlessly down the center of her back. She felt no pain, only warmth and dust and age. Then silence. Not absence. Transition. Elsewhere, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the lobby of the city's oldest library. A young woman, sharp eyes, a backpack too full for comfort, smiled nervously as she signed her name onto the internship log. The pen skipped on the paper. The air conditioning rattled behind the walls. Somewhere deeper in the library, a quiet, low thrum ticked through the floorboards. Her name tag gleamed with fresh lamination. Her steps echoed with eagerness. A custodian pointed her toward the archives wing, and she followed the long corridor, admiring the stonework, the impossible symmetry. She had wanted this internship more than anything. She didn't know why. Just something about this place. It called to her. Inside her welcome packet was a map of the building, a stack of confidentiality forms, and a crisp white envelope addressed with her name in looping cursive. There was no return address, no indication of its origin. She opened it. Inside, a single slip of paper. Handwritten, clean, familiar Samkhru. The note read, "Don't look for room number 9. Ivu." She furrowed her brow. She didn't remember seeing anyone named Evie in the faculty list. But curiosity always wins. She folded the note and tucked it into her bag, telling herself she'd ask about it later. She turned the first corner, and the map she'd been given already felt inaccurate. The hallway was longer than it should have been. The shadows curved the wrong way. She didn't notice. You close the journal. Your eyes linger on the final page. There's no the end. Instead, something catches your attention in the margins. You hadn't noticed it before. A faint scribble, not typed, not printed. It's in your handwriting, but you don't remember writing it. The ink is still drying.